As most of you know, John is a professor of mathematics, and he has extensive interest in philosophy, science, and religion. He has written on this topic in many forums. He has debated atheists, philosophers, scientists across the world, and he has taught in many prestigious academic institutions around the world. And John, you're here for the weekend, and I thank you so much for taking time to come to University of Toronto in this intimate setting. So the program is that John will be giving a talk for 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A. So if any question pops up in your head while listening to John, just write it down, and we will bring the mic to you during the Q&A at 1 o'clock. Okay, so as John is talking, please continue to eat, but as long as you can focus and concentrate on what he has to say. Thank you so much. Please help me in welcoming John Lennox.
Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. There's a definition of a mathematician, which is someone who talks in other people's sleep. And we're going to modify that today. And the mathematician is now someone who talks in other people's eat. And thank you very much for the invitation. You know, as I drove here and saw the names of the streets like Spadina and Eglinton Avenue and Yonge Street, it brought me back 52 years. When in 1962 I came to Toronto for 3 or 4 months and learned to say Toronto, and also learned to drive on the wrong side of the road. So that stood me very well in the last while. Now, I'm intrigued by your title, actually. It's quite interesting to think about it. Is religion intellectually dangerous? And my immediate reaction was to say probably. And the next thing was to think of books that have appeared like Darwin's Dangerous Idea, or Dawkins' Dangerous Idea, or Lewis' Dangerous Idea. Or Sam Harris saying in his book, some ideas are so dangerous that we might have to kill for them. Or Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, sadly, religion poisons everything. But of course we need to be more specific. Do we mean religions as such? Do we mean specific religions, or do we mean the ideas that are contained within religions? Or we think of danger as a kind of mental virus that distorts our intellectual capacities and makes us unpleasant people? Or do we mean it leads to the dangers of violence and explicit attempts to liquidate other people and so on? Interestingly enough, in this context, if you try to analyze why it is we've had such a militant response from the atheistic people, they themselves say that 9/11 radicalized them. And it was in terms of ideology they responded, dangerous ideas contained within religion as they saw it. And the reaction was simply that this is extremist religion. And it's very dangerous. And if you argue that, well, there are more moderate versions of religion, they will say, but you see, extreme religion can only thrive if you've got moderate religion. So the only answer to the whole thing is to eliminate religion. And Steven Weinberg, who's a Nobel Prize winner for physics, notably said publicly that science needs to contribute. Its major contribution in this generation ought to be the elimination of religion. And anything, I quote, we scientists can do to effect that aim should be done. There's a pretty dangerous idea, for a start, coming within atheism. And I'm going to broaden this out slightly because it's pitched, is religion intellectually dangerous? I'm going to suggest to you it can be, and atheism can also be intellectually very dangerous, and dangerous in other ways as well. So we'll open it out, and I'd like you to listen actively, in other words, thinking of questions. And the best way to have good questions is actually to write them down as I talk, because what I'm going to do at the end, I'll collect anything you've written, but I'm going to take the questions in batches because that's far more interesting both for you and for me. In an audience like this, everybody is automatically interested in everybody else's question. So I'm going to give you the chance to hear a number of questions so that we can see the spectrum of ideas that you want to cover, and then I will be able to give a much more considered response to them together. So that's the way we'll operate. And when we come to the end, and I better have a look at a watch because I'm operating on Irish Standard Time, which may not be the same as Toronto time. So, at the level of religion and dangerous ideas, we can think of a whole lot of words that would express that: fundamentalism, obscurantism, anti-intellectualism, sexism, racism, violence, and so on. Now, clearly, there are many religions in the world, and it would be wrong of me to attempt to speak as the spokesman for all of them. I can't do that. I'm a Christian, and so I can only really speak from that perspective, and that's okay. Other religions have the right and ought to be able to come into the public arena and speak for themselves about the accusations that are made against them. And I do that without any embarrassment, because I notice that when the new atheists attack religion, it's normally Christianity. Christopher Hitchens amused me greatly when he said, "I'm really a Protestant atheist." And it reminds me of Ireland, where you meet two kinds of atheists, Catholic ones and Protestant ones, you see. I met real ones when I got to pagan England at Cambridge in 1962. And that set my life's course, because being brought up in a country where religion was prominent, and having wonderful parents who were Christian without being sectarian, which is a very interesting thing, and secondly, who allowed me to think, I was fascinated what it is that motivates people to have worldviews other than mine. And I've spent my whole life doing it. Because one of the accusations is that religion is a dangerous idea. And if you're brought up Christian, you'll stay Christian. It'll color everything. It'll spoil you intellectually and everything else. So actually, the prime motivation for a lot of the things I do was precisely that it's such a dangerous idea that Freud's analysis applies to it. It's simply wish fulfillment, the father figure in the sky, and that's a very dangerous idea indeed, especially when it comes to intellectual development. So I've got a personal history that's very attached to the question that you've asked me here. And I probably won't go the full time because I'm far more interested in your questions, and we'll get to those as fast as we can. But because I grew up in a situation where the ideas, at least some religious ideas, were involved in the political ferment that was Northern Ireland in the late 50s, early 60s. It's worth commenting on that. Isn't this the unacceptable face of religion? Well, of course it is. And my reaction to it is to say, firstly, I'm ashamed of it, thoroughly ashamed of it. Ashamed that the bomb and the AK-47 have ever been associated with the name of Christ. But I want to explain why I'm ashamed of it. And this is important historically. You see, the idea that religion spawns violence, other religions, as I say, have to answer for themselves. But it's not an idea that goes back to Christ. Indeed, people who take up bombs and rockets and things to defend Christ or his message aren't following him, they're disobeying him. Because, and here's the irony of much of the atheist critique of Christianity, Christ was put on trial for fomenting political terrorism. We forget that. And he was exonerated from it. It's a very interesting trial. I used to wonder why there's so much historical evidence in the New Testament about the trial of Christ as distinct from his death, resurrection, and so on. But I think I now realize why, because it's the charge that was made and the reason for the exoneration that is so important. Christ, extraordinarily for that time, was tried by the leading Roman power broker in the region, Pilate. That is totally abnormal, which shows the kind of threat he felt he was under. This man was dangerous. He had dangerous ideas. And so Pilate decided to investigate his claim to be king himself. Are you a king? And Christ said yes, but not quite in the sense you think, because my kingdom is not of this world. Otherwise, my servants would have been fighting. But now my kingdom's not from here. And of course, Pilate realized instinctively that he was no threat to Rome, especially when Christ went on to say, "To this end I was born, and to this end I came into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth." And you remember the famous response, "What is truth?" And I don't think it was cynical. But this discussion between Pilate and Christ about the relationship between power and truth is very profound. But Pilate realized what we all must realize, that the one thing you cannot do with power and violence is impose truth. And he went out and said, "I find no fault in him." That's very important. I pointed it out to Christopher Hitchens, who, when I encountered him at the Edinburgh Festival, it was very interesting because the Edinburgh Festival is one of it is the premier festival of arts and literature in Europe, and the man that organized it decided to have a God thing at the beginning. I don't know why he did that, but I got invited to debate Christopher Hitchens. And Christopher started with a vitriolic, and of course brilliantly worded, he was quite a urbane and interesting character, attack on Christianity for 15 minutes. And I just stood up and said, "Well, Christopher, you're dead right. That's the unacceptable thing." And then I went on to explain this. It's actually very important that in this 21st century, when we're surrounded by dangerous ideas that are driving wars, religious wars of almost every imaginable kind in the world today, this is a real topic. And therefore, it's very important for me as a Christian to see clearly what exactly Christianity teaches. And to see that, you will recall the story, if you've ever read it in the New Testament, where when Peter, the apostle, tried to defend Christ at his arrest, he wasn't a very good swordsman, and he had a go at cutting somebody's head off, which is, alas, all too frequent today. But Peter missed and cut the chap's ear off. And Luke, who was a physician, incidentally, and understood the difference between science and understood the basic questions about miracle, which is a separate topic, tells us that Christ repaired the ear and put it on. But I'm an Irishman, you see, and I'm a storyteller, and I've got a literary imagination. You'd be very dim not to see what this is saying. If you take the sword or any other weapon to defend Christ or his message, you will cut the ears off people in a very big way. I noticed that Christ put it back on. So I consider myself to be in the ear repair business. It's a new medical discipline, actually, for those of you who are medical consultants like our colleague here who introduced the thing. The ear repair business. Because many of my friends, and I understand them, they won't even listen to the Christian message because their ears have been cut off. The ideas are far too dangerous. They have had a negative experience, perhaps, or they've seen violence, and you can understand where they're coming from. This mix of ideas is a cocktail, it's explosive. So we have to patiently investigate the history. Is this actually what Christ taught? And I say, look, whatever people claim, those who go into violence are not defending Christ. They're not Christian at all, of course. They're fighting against him. And Hitchens, bless him, he was very, very interested in this analysis. So there's that side of it. The second side of it, of course, is the one I hinted at before. Richard Dawkins and his Freudian analysis of Christianity as being dangerous, a virus of the mind, and so on and so forth. And I take those statements seriously because delusion is dangerous. There are various levels of delusion. You know, I might, as an Irishman, believe there are leprechauns at the bottom of my garden. That kind of a delusion won't cause too much harm. But delusional religion can be very dangerous. And Dawkins is convinced that Christianity is not only a delusion, but a pernicious delusion. That is, it's dangerous. It leads to very seriously negative consequences. Now, we must take seriously that kind of analysis because it's very familiar. It goes back a very long way. Indeed, it goes back to the New Testament because when the Roman civil official, Festus, investigated Paul, he said, "Much learning has made you mad." The accusation of delusional attitudes is very old indeed. It's at least 20 centuries old. But we get it in the 21st century. And it's the idea is simple. Look, you've projected an image of your desire for a father figure. You're too weak to stand on your own against the bleakness of the real picture of the universe. And so you've made these inventions. And they are dangerous because you are depending on imaginary, fictitious ideas for your life support. Now, one of the best analyses of this is by a German psychiatrist, Manfred Lutz. And incidentally, Dawkins is talking psychiatry, and he knows it when he mentions religion as a delusion in his God Delusion book, because he defines a delusion as a persistent false idea that is held in spite of strong countervailing evidence, especially in psychiatric disorder. And he leaves aside the level of psychiatric disorder. But when I noticed that, I thought, well, I need to analyze this because I'm not a psychiatrist, and neither is Dawkins. And of course, when you do that, you know instinctively that you've got to go to top psychiatrists. When I go outside my own field, I need to be very, as I'm doing during this lunch, by the way, I need to be very careful to consult the experts in the field. And I wondered, had Dawkins done that, and found very rapidly that he'd done no such thing. And it's very interesting when you do the research. At the first level, just on the Freudian argument, Manfred Lutz has written this brilliant book. It's very witty. I heard him lecture in Hamburg. I was lecturing with him just a few days ago. And it's called Eine kleine Geschichte des Größten, which for those of you who don't speak German, it means a brief history of the great one, meaning God. And what he says is this: if there is no God, then of course Freud's argument works brilliantly to show that religion is a delusion. If there is no God. But then he says, if there is a God, of course the very same argument will show you that atheism is a delusion. The projection of the desire never to have to meet God, to answer for the mess we've made of our lives and others. And that's very important. It works both ways. And so on the substantive point, he goes on to say, of whether there's a God or not, Freud can't help you at all. You have to go elsewhere. So it works both ways. And it's funny, actually, if you'll forgive a personal reference, Stephen Hawking, the famous physicist in the wheelchair, and many of you have probably seen The Theory of Everything, said in a newspaper, one of our leading newspapers some time ago, religion is a fairy story for people afraid of the dark. And that's a typical Freudian reaction. And I was asked to comment, and I said, well, if you want a brief comment, I'll give it to you. Atheism is a fairy story for people afraid of the light. Well, it proves nothing, of course. It's simply an assertion. But the Freudian argument works both ways, and that was the point I was trying to make. We need to be more serious than this. But interestingly enough, there's a lot of psychiatric work has been done on well-being and human flourishing, which I notice is becoming increasingly an intellectual discipline. There's a course at Yale, I believe there may be one at Harvard, and spawning courses all around the world on human flourishing. And so I went to the top of psychiatry. The past president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the United Kingdom is Andrew Sims. And he says some fascinating things in his book, Is Faith a Delusion? And he points out, one, that the positive correlation between religious belief and human well-being is, I quote, the best kept secret of psychiatry. He says, if the results of a massive amount of epidemiological research had gone the other way, and it demonstrated a negative correlation, in other words, it demonstrated that religious belief damages your health, he said it would have been front page on every newspaper in the world. But because the correlation is positive, it's the best kept secret, nobody talks about it. And then he goes on to cite a major meta-analysis, that is an analysis of analyses, done in the American Journal of Health, which says, roughly speaking, that religious belief is correlated with well-being, with less abuse of drugs, with positive attitudes to marriage, with positive attitudes to other people, etc. A huge long list of things, every one of which we would automatically approve. And I think, where is the evidence of this in Dawkins' writings? None at all. And that's serious, you see. Because if you pretend to be an academic, an intellectual, and base your results on science, well then why don't you do so? And that really removes a great deal of confidence in my mind from the kind of thing that Dawkins writes in The God Delusion. And of course, this is his opening thesis. It is seriously flawed. And even atheist writers have pointed that out in some detail. But I haven't time to remain with that particular thing. I simply make the point that it is a statement that borders on the psychiatric. When you examine the actual evidence of the connection between religious and in particular, but not only Christian belief, there is a positive correlation between human flourishing and well-being and religion. And that needs to be taken on board. The fact that it's absent from his book shows that the book is skewed and therefore does not deserve to be taken particularly seriously. Now, the second thing is that, and it's connected with it, that many people regard faith as the problem. Faith is the great evil. Faith, I quote from Dawkins again. I often quote from him because he writes well, you know, or used to, and is very quotable. And because many people read him, it's not that other people don't say the same kind of thing. Of course they do. But faith is an evil precisely because it requires no justification and brooks no argument. Or Michel Onfray, who's a kind of French intellectual philosopher equivalent of Dawkins, in his Traité d'Athéisme and various other books he's written, he says monotheism loathes intelligence. God puts to death everything that stands up to him, beginning with reason, intelligence, and the critical mind. Well, that's all wrong, you see. But it's clever, because what they've done very subtly is to redefine faith. Faith, in English, comes from the Latin fides, from which we get fidelity. And of course, it's related, and its cognates in Latin and Greek, pistis and so on, mean trust, relying on something. And it's an ordinary word. I will talk freely about having faith in my wife, and so on and so forth. I have a certain amount of faith in Einstein's equations and Maxwell's equations and so on. And indeed, as a scientist, I cannot do my science without believing that science can be done. Isn't that obvious? That's very important. You see, the new atheist redefinition of faith obscures a number of very important things and makes the intellectual debate all the more complex. And we need to get it sorted out. It seems to me it has produced a huge intellectual fog. I would like to submit to you that atheism has provided us with a delusional definition of faith. That is technically within the parameters of Dawkins' definition, a persistent false belief that's held in the teeth of strong countervailing evidence. Firstly, from its etymology, but secondly, and now I especially apply it to Christianity, Christianity is evidence-based faith. The problem with the word, incidentally, is we use it for several different things. I'm often asked to give lectures on science and faith. I refuse to do it. Because I say, do you want me to talk about God? They say, of course. Well, I said, I don't see that in the title. They say, yes, it's in the title. Faith. I say, faith in what? The sentence is not finished. I can give you a talk on science and faith without mentioning God, because faith is part of science. Well, usually they say, is it? And that shows that the skewed definition has been accepted. The polarization, science and faith, is an atheistic formulation. If you want to parallel science with something, either theology, because science is a set of intellectual disciplines, either theology, I prefer God and science, but not faith and science, because that immediately polarizes them. So to redress the balance, my argument would be something like this. Firstly, Christianity is an evidence-based faith. Now, we all understand evidence-based faith after the financial crisis. Some people had faith in the bankers. Do you remember that? And then it collapsed, and the markets froze because, as I said, there's no longer any grounds for confidence, faith in the markets. And they only began to unfreeze when confidence was restored. There's not a person, an adult in the Western world that doesn't understand evidence-based faith. But now, when it comes to Christianity, you ask the question, is it evidence-based? Well, of course it is, and claims to be. The prime statement of it is, perhaps this. It occurs at the end of John's Gospel, where John, the author, says, Jesus did many other things that are not written in this book. But these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. Here's the evidence on which faith can be based. It's evidence-based faith. And that absolutely makes nonsense of the idea that faith is not evidence-based. That is not true of Christianity. And of course, the other thing is, just as important, is that getting the definition of faith straight shows that it's essential to science. I was taught quantum physics at Cambridge by Professor Sir John Polkinghorne, and he never tires of reminding us in his writings that physics, I quote, is powerless to explain its faith in the mathematical intelligibility of the universe, for the very simple reason that you cannot do any physics without believing that to start with. And you see, here's the interesting thing. The idea that faith is a delusion, well, if that's true, we wouldn't have modern science. Because you see, modern science is the gift of Christianity. Did you realize that? We think of Galileo and Kepler, Newton, and so on, James Clerk Maxwell, all believers in God, which has led to what's called Merton's thesis, North Whitehead's thesis, and many other names. But C.S. Lewis put it best, as usual, when he said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. It was faith in God that gave us modern science. That's an interesting thing, isn't it? And immediately shifts the whole perspective. And we need to then investigate why we've got to where we've got, where Newton's successor, Stephen Hawking, thinks that we have to choose between science and God. So is religion intellectually dangerous in the sense that it is anti-science? Well, absolutely not. In the case of Christianity, for the reason I've just given, and secondly, because it is the biblical tradition that promotes science. Not only in the sense historically that I gave to you, but actually because the Genesis story tells us of God telling humans to name the animals. And taxonomy is the fundamental intellectual discipline, isn't it? You represent different faculties and departments in the University of Toronto. You all know words that I don't know, and I know words you don't know. And those words are part of our taming of the universe. The proliferation of words. Often the medical students, we have many of them in my college, and they find it difficult sometimes to learn all the bones in the body and all the different nerves and so on and so forth, but they have to learn them because that's part of the discipline of understanding, is naming things. God said, you go and do it. I'm not going to do it for you. And that I find enormously encouraging as a mandate for me to do science. And there's loads more I could say, but I have a website, johnlennox.org, and so on. I just want to conclude, to give you plenty of time. I can't remember when I started. When was I supposed to stop? 1 o'clock, okay. I'll stop before 1 o'clock. We asked the question, is religion dangerous? I think it can be, as I've illustrated. It doesn't have to be. And I think Christianity, far from being intellectually dangerous, is intellectually exhilarating. And that is part of my biography too. You see, I grew up in a home where my father was Christian and allowed me to think and encouraged me to read widely. I'd read a huge number of books before I came to university. And Christianity, to me, was associated with intellectual openness, of inquiring, reading other people's worldviews. My father came to me when I was about 13, handed me a book. He said, have you read this? I said, what is it, Dad? He says, it's the Communist Manifesto. I said, that wasn't a usual gift in Northern Ireland, I can tell you. have you read it? I said, no, I haven't read it. Well, he said, you ought to read it. You need to know what these people think. Little did he know that I was going to spend many, many, many months traveling during the Cold War behind the Iron Curtain in the German-speaking part, talking to people about the effect of atheism in a culture. And then when the wall fell, going to Russia, where I also speak the language, talking to people in the Academy of Sciences about this whole effect, 75 years of atheism. And that's the note on which I want to end, because, you see, the question in our title is loaded. Is religion intellectually dangerous? Nobody thought of putting in the title, is atheism intellectually dangerous? It would be more balanced to say, can ideologies of both sides be intellectually dangerous? And the answer is, of course, yes. Now, here's another gripe I have at the new atheists. Gott ist an allem schuld. God's to blame for everything was the title page of Der Spiegel some years ago, and a vitriolic attack. There wasn't a trace of the fact that atheism has been responsible for more bloodshed in the 20th century than all religious history put together. Usually, Dawkins loves to cite John Lennon, you know, Imagine. Do you know the song Imagine? Imagine, well, it's a lovely tune. It's captivating, you know. The words are disastrous, in my opinion, but the tune is beautiful. Well, I'm not John Lennon, I'm John Lennox, as you probably know. And I've written a song, and it's called Imagine. Imagine a world without Stalin, Mao, or Pol Pot. What about that world? I don't read anything of it in the God Delusion. I read silly things like Dawkins can't imagine an atheist who would bulldoze a cathedral like Chartres Notre Dame. And I was speaking about that in the Academy of Sciences in Warsaw, and some professors stopped me, and I thought I'd done something awful. And I stopped, and they said, send him over to us. I mean, it's absurd. I've stood beside many holes in the ground where cathedrals used to exist. And a very witty German politician who writes beautifully, Richard Schröder, said Dawkins is technically right. Ulbricht and Stalin used dynamite because bulldozers are not powerful enough to knock down cathedrals. But this is such a silly evaluation. Anybody who thinks atheism has nothing to do with the totalitarian destruction of life in the 20th century has never read Marx in any detail. And you know, so many people in the Academy of Sciences would say to me wistfully, they'd say, John, you know, we thought that we could get rid of God and retain a value for human life, and we discovered far too late that we couldn't. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn, when he left Russia for America, gave a speech in which he responded to the question to answer briefly why 100 million of his fellow citizens had perished. He said, the answer is, we have forgotten God. Now, that's a devastating critique. And when all has been said and done about the evils of religion and what has been done in the name of Christ, there's no excuse for it, but it pales into insignificance compared with what has happened not in the first century, ladies and gentlemen, but in the last century. So atheism is very dangerous, it seems to me. Now, it's dangerous for other reasons, because I would want to submit to you that it's actually anti-science in the end, and it undermines the scientific endeavor. But that's enough from me. I'll open it now for your questions. Thank you very much indeed. So we've now got a microphone, and I've got a pad of paper here. So what I'm going to do is put up your hand, formulate your question as briefly as possible, and I write it down, and we'll see where we get to after a series of questions. There's number one over there. And please keep them on the topic. I'm not here to discuss Canadian politics. Or British politics, for that matter. Okay, who's going first?
It is on now. Here we go.
Now it's on.
Thank you very much.
Hi, John. It's my privilege to listen to you, and I'm proud to say, like, you are my role model. And I kind of emailed to all my professors at my school before coming to this talk, whoever want to come with me.
Well, that's kind of you. And what's your question?
Yeah, my question is like, you mentioned in many of your talks as well, as long as the faith is evidence-based, it's not dangerous. It makes you free, it's good. But it's not the same situation for everyone to investigate whether the faith is evidence-based. And it's not possible for everyone to become a scholar and to find out, investigate all the factors contributing a strong evidence, right? Based on their intellectual abilities, based on the capability to read other social situations. So in that situation, of course I know if it's not possible, there is another way to listen to the guys like you and understand who spend their life in finding the truth, finding the evidence. But more or less, second one is we can be convinced by our personal experience with God, right? If I pray.
Well, let's get to the question because.
Yeah, that's what I mean. The people who don't have a chance to do investigation, spend their life, who solely believe their faith with their personal relationship through prayer, is it dangerous?
Okay, let me respond to that in a moment. Number 2. Just start.
Okay, thank you, John. I'm on the Faculty of Geography here at U of T. I'm a human geographer, so I have some observations of the social science disciplines as of today. I think it's largely based on 3 kind of philosophies, some variants of Marxism, some sort of anti-liberalism, and some sort of post-structural nihilism, I would say. This is in the academia, in social sciences. Outside in the society, one thing I recently heard a friend at Boston, her daughter, who is like 6-year-old, she was saying like, "Oh my God," in her daycare, and she was reminded by the teachers that you'd better just say, "Oh my goodness." I think this is quite representative of the changing culture, which is rapidly and radically against any association with religion, especially with regard to Christianity. So my question is, first, what do you foresee the future of this kind of trend? And also, as Christian, what do you think we can do to change?
Okay,
Thanks.
Thank you. Third.
Thank you so much for the talk. I thought it was really interesting. I was just wondering, we know we're talking about the role of science and religion, how they sort of interplay. We know that most scientists today, of course, are overwhelmingly non-religious. So whether atheist or in some other sense secular, I was just wondering what your perspective might be on this, given that science was once sort of under the purview or sphere of religion and religious influence.
Okay.
To what extent do we as Christians, in today's efforts of the governments, the people, the atheists, to deny Christianity and wipe it out, to what extent do we fight back and how?
Okay. 5.
Sir, you mentioned that atheism can be anti-science. Since multiverse cosmology is considered to be untestable, would you consider that an example? And why do you think it's become so popular?
Okay. See, my tactic is to keep asking for questions until the time's up, and then I'll run. Okay, we'll get to 7. I've got 5. 2 more. Come on.
To what extent ought a Christian biblical scholar who holds to a particular confession of faith allow his or her presuppositions to be adjusted or corrected by his or her research? If certain historical conclusions which the researcher aims to query have already been decided as a matter of confessional faith prior to the investigation, then is the scholar's research less intellectually genuine? Why or why not? Is the ability to suspend the conclusion prior to the research a necessary mark of genuine intellectual pursuit?
Okay. 7. getting more and more interesting, isn't it?
Thanks very much. Oh, sure thing. Hi, yeah, so thanks for the talk. Great points. So my question involved basically, so when you mentioned that it requires trust to do science, you have to trust that the universe is intelligible to do science.
Yeah, sure.
I'm just wondering, how do you justify that position? Just because you really don't. If I try to do an experiment, and I think that I can predict the outcome, if the universe isn't intelligible to the degree that I can do so, my prediction is just going to fall flat. And I can keep trying in various ways, and if the universe just doesn't operate according to logical laws, it seems to me I just won't get the answers I'm looking for. So I guess it's more of a question of, when do you give up on science?
Okay, that'll do, I think. Right, now this is a Q&A, so it's by definition unsatisfactory. For the obvious reason that I could give 7 lectures here in response to it. So I could only give you my immediate reaction, but that's a good thing, because the research you do in answer to your own question is far more important than anything I'm going to say about it. So take it in that spirit. It's inadequate, but by definition so. And that's good for your health. Because if you're really interested in the question, you will not be content with what I say. You'll go and do some more work on it. So let's have a look where we start. Well, I start at the beginning. I may not follow the order completely, but you talked about people who can't respond intellectually and so on, more humble people possibly, or people that don't have adequate access to the kind of sources that we do in this room. Well, I wouldn't be a Christian for 30 seconds if I believed that God couldn't speak to them as well. You see, I've been asked to talk about, is religion intellectually dangerous? And that's a very limited sphere of investigation. What I would say in answer to your question is, God gives evidence at all kinds of different levels. And the person is simply trust God because they've seen the glory of the universe. All the stuff that we know and they don't is a justification for the validity of their response, even though they don't know about it. In other words, what I'm saying is, God will never judge a person for evidence they never had or could have. And the Bible is very clear about that. Christ once, discussing with people, he said, to the Pharisees, if you were blind, you would have no sin. God will never judge anybody for not seeing something they cannot see. So let me give you an analogy. Nobody knows what energy is, but we all use it. If you've noticed, we're using it now with electrical light and so on. There are lots of things we don't know at different levels, but we can still use them. I can switch a light on without knowing anything about electricity, and it'll work because there are others who know about it. So when people went around the ancient world like Paul and preached the message of Christ, the central things were not a whole lot of philosophical arguments, but were actual historical facts about his life, death, resurrection, and his offer of forgiveness, and so on. Anybody can respond to that. And that's one of the evidences that, to me, that Christianity is true. It's not only for an intellectual elite. And that doesn't absolve us of the responsibility of obeying Christ's command to go into all the world and preach the gospel. But we do need to realize that we can get intellectually immensely proud, and that's dangerous. That God will speak to people at levels that they do understand. And actually, you will find even in the 21st century, most of the people that I meet that have become Christians is a result of friendship. And people showing love to them and care for them and presenting them with what you said at the very beginning, a real role model, somebody that they could look up to and take as credible. Now, the geographer there gave me an interesting insight into the 3 philosophies at the University of Toronto. Marx, anti-liberalism, and post-structuralism. And the little girl who said, "Oh my God," was told to say, "Oh my goodness." This can open a huge can of worms, and it is a can of worms, because it has to do with a lot of notions that are flowing in our current society. One of them is that naturalism is the default worldview. And therefore, every other worldview has to fight to get at the table. And this relates to many of the other questions as well, what we do in our culture. Well, one of the things is not to give in to the fact that there's a default worldview. The Christian worldview, the biblical, the theistic worldview, is as ancient as the naturalistic worldview. We forget that. The ancient Hebrew scriptures predate the Greeks. Have you ever noticed that university courses in philosophy always start with the Greeks? That biases the thing at the beginning because the Greeks had to get rid of their gods before they could do science. The Hebrews didn't, because they only believed in one God. Their problem was to compromise with the kind of idolatry that was characteristic of the Greeks. It's more complicated than you think. And therefore, it seems to me, if we realize where we stand historically, we'll not be swayed by postmodern relativism, which is dying out even in many faculties of English, I see, because it is self-contradictory. In a very amusing way, I was sitting once in my college, forgive me telling a story, but people like stories. Do you want a story? Okay, so this man was sitting with his book on the table so as I could see it. And I was intrigued. I'd never met him before. He was a guest of the college, clearly. So I said, what's your book about? Well, he said, this book really proves that there's no such thing as authorial intention. And I thought, what? So I said to him quietly, you mean if I read your book, I'll know that there's no such thing as authorial intention? He said, exactly. Well, I said, I'm not going to read it. He said, why not? Well, I said, if you're right, there's no such thing as authorial intention, so you're wrong in describing to me the intention with which you wrote it. He'd never thought of it. He got up and he walked out. You see, the funny thing, and I'm very interested in literature, and I'm not taking potshots because I think that the postmodern critique of science has done us the service of actually allowing science to realize that it's a discipline done by humans who have biases and prejudices and all of that. But when it comes to the kind of notion, everything is relative, and that statement is made as an absolute statement, otherwise it's meaningless, there's a little clever thing going on there. It's that the person makes an exception of themselves when making the statement as to its validity, so it's not universal, so it's logically contradictory. So we need to point these things out, I feel, and really get back to the ancient basis of many of our great universities. They had God and science and literature and all of that together. And to airbrush out the whole God question, as Europe has done in its constitution, is such almost blasphemy of history. It seems to me an utter tragedy. And the other thing that's come in is, of course, political correctness, isn't it? That tolerance used to mean tolerare in Latin. I tolerate you means I disagree with you, but I'll support your right in public to express your ideas. But now tolerance means that I mustn't say anything in case I offend you. I must not only agree with you, I must celebrate what you say and what you think. That's the end of all discussion. And it's totalitarian thought control that we're entering into. And we need to think seriously about it. Isn't it interesting that the hegemony of atheism, instead of freeing people up to think, is actually entering into the period of thought control? That's the exact opposite of the freedom for which people long. And therefore, I take it very seriously, which is why, to answer your question, sir, I step into the public debate. I have many reasons for doing so. It's terrifying. If anybody thinks it's fun debating Dawkins, let them think again. These are some of the most emotionally draining experiences I've ever had in my life. But it's got to be done, because the image presented to the general public, if nobody takes up the challenge, is that they win by default. And I don't want that to happen. And so I think that what we need to do is to stop being silent. And this is addressed to Christians. Those of you who are atheists, just close your ears for a moment. It's very important that we're not silent. Two things. We need to engage with society. And for many Christians, the atheists might be interested to hear, there is fear. Indeed, the recent surveys done in Britain in the last couple of weeks say that for the first time in history, Christians are now afraid to say that they're Christians. It used to be the atheists said they were afraid to say they were atheists. But now the Christians are afraid. So there's a real fear barrier to be fought through. And that fear barrier usually consists in, what if I'm asked a question I don't know the answer to? Well, you certainly will. So you've got to battle that. And what do you do when that happens? You're honest and you say, I don't know the answer to that question. I'd like to think about it. Will you allow me to go away and think about it? Christians are not people, I hope, who claim to have every answer to every question. It was very funny. I had a debate with Michael Shermer at the Oxford Union not long ago, and he'd forgotten he'd debated me twice before. So significant the debate was. And he was wearing a big badge, S for skeptic, you see. And he stuck out his hand and he said, I'm a skeptic. I said, so am I. He said, are you? Yes, sure. He said, what are you skeptical of? I said, your atheism for a start. And I said, Michael, you wear an S. What does skepticism mean? The Greek word skeptine, what does it mean? Well, he didn't know. It means to check out from a distance. Do you think you're the only person that checks things out from a distance? What sort of a business is that? It's ridiculous, really, when you think about it. Of course, we check things out from a distance, otherwise we're fools. But then there comes a time when we've got to give up our distance. You'll never get to know me if I don't give up my distance. You never get to know a person if you don't give up your distance. So in the public space, we need to do God. To quote the Tony Blair's aide that said, we don't do God here. Well, we do God. And it was very interesting when the Pope, not this one, but the one before, Ratzinger, came to England and made it very clear that we do God in public. And we need to get back to that. But it's hard and it's tough and there's a lot of prejudice going on there. But we need to start with a circle of our friends and get discussions going. Dinners with a difference. Give people something to read, a bit of literature, and discuss it. And people get terrified of this and say, I can never run a discussion. Well, you don't have to. Just keep your mouth shut. But show them something. If you found a video or a clip that's interesting, people are far more interested, I tell you, in sitting at dinner discussing something than hearing about your last year's holiday in the Bahamas. And I love to see a bit of intellectual activity going on in homes. And people that have tried this find it just absolutely fascinating. And it needn't be biblical literature. I often use Plato because I'm very interested in the ancient Greeks, to get a discussion going about the big ideas. And the more we get discussions going about the big ideas, the more people will see that we are interesting people. If you want people to find you interesting, you'd better be interested in more things than a narrow concept of your own religious commitments. So, listening to other people. I have a little, and this is an aside really, but when I meet people, new people, I try to practice this rule, which is very difficult for an Irishman. And it's this: I keep asking them questions until they ask me one. Try it. It leads to completely different social dynamics than the attitude when you go into discussion and you want to unload your message or your ideas. Listen. So that's one of my reactions to this. Now, let's have a look down here. You asked, sir, to what extent should Christians fight back? Well, the metaphor fighting is sometimes ill-advised, but if you take it in a metaphorical sense rather than a physical sense, I think it is very important. We have the right in our society, it's supposed to be a Western liberal democracy, to make our views known in public. So we ought to make every effort to put on serious events. It's much better to organize one event a year that's good than 10 events that are no good. To raise the profile, because society out there, sadly, has got the impression, given to them sometimes by Christians, that we're anti-intellectual, we're not interested in reasoning and all this kind of thing. That is an insult to God, who gave us his first commandment, love the Lord your God with your mind. That is very important, it seems to me, to be credible within society. Now, the next question said the overwhelming number of scientists are non-religious. That isn't true, sir. That is not true. The last survey was done in American Who's Who in Science. 40% said they believed not only in God, but a personal God who answers prayer. It is a myth that it's overwhelmingly non-religious. In Oxford, my own university, there's a number of heads of famous departments that are absolutely convinced Christians. But the myth has been perpetuated. It is true that at the Nobel Prize winner level, the percentage is about 7. It's quite low, but there could be reasons for that. They might have spent more time thinking about science than they did about other things. You can't decide things by statistics, but that impression actually at general level of science isn't completely accurate. So we need to fight back against that. And if we decided things by being in a minority, Christianity would never have got started. Because when it got started, there were only a dozen people and a few more, and Paul and his team was about 3.5, wasn't it? I mean, it wasn't a big deal confronting a world that was pluralist, relativist, and had all the skeptics that you can imagine. And it is also true that with the decline in church-going, and incidentally, in England at least, the main reason given for that is they don't answer our questions. And that's a serious challenge. They don't answer our questions. With the decline in church-going, we need to raise the profile and bring back two things, real living role models and real intellectual commitment so that people can observe it. Now, somebody asked, I made the rather provocative statement at the end that atheism turns out in the end to be anti-science, and you gave the example you felt the multiverse might fit into that category, and why is it popular? Well, that's a huge topic. Again, it's one of those clever notions that present people with false alternatives. If I go back to the man who really propagated it initially, Max Tegmark in Princeton, he wrote, either there is God or there is a multiverse, but that's logically false. God can create as many universes as he likes, actually. The question is, do they exist? And there the problems start, as you hinted. They're not accessible to us, and so scientists are divided among them. Martin Rees, our astronomer royal, says some people prefer to think of a single creator, like his colleague John Polkinghorne, who doesn't like the multiverse idea. But I prefer to believe in the multiverse. Please notice the word prefer. This isn't science. This is preference that's driven by something else. Now, I could say a great deal about multiverses, but I'm not going to because I've written about them. And if you want to pursue the little I know, God and Stephen Hawking might be the small book that you find useful. But much more interesting than the multiverse, in a way, is the rate at which science now, because of its standard model of the universe and an initial singularity, is driven to trying to derive a universe from nothing. And so the two poles of the debate now are either God not or the multiverse, but it's God or nothing. And that is fascinating to me. And it raises all kinds of questions. And just as the new atheists have redefined faith, the scientists have redefined nothing. Because they can't get a universe from philosophical nothing, that's the absence of anything. They redefine nothing to be a quantum vacuum, which isn't nothing. And I happen to be fortunate enough to have had a public discussion with Alan Guth, who's the father of the inflation theory and the leading cosmologist in the world. It was at the Harvard-MIT faculty club where we got 150 professors. And I couldn't help asking him the question when I got him in public. I said, Alan, you know, there's much ado about nothing out there in the public. Tell us, when you as a cosmologist talk about nothing, you don't mean nothing in the basic sense of absence of anything. He said, of course we don't. And if you want to see the extremes to which leading astrophysicists will go, think of Lawrence Krauss in his book, A Universe from Nothing, where he says this. Now, I know it's lunchtime and the food is being digested by the blood that ought to be in your brain, and that causes a serious hazard. But allowing for that, how would you analyze this, and what would you think of it as a statement? Because something is physical, nothing must be physical, especially if you define it as the absence of something. That's absurd. It is an utter nonsense statement, and it's made by a leading astrophysicist. Something's afoot, ladies and gentlemen. The desire to avoid the God answer is getting into absurdity and foolishness. So there's that. But there's lots of other things that could be said about that. Now, the question about Christian scholars adjusting and so on within evidence and reacting, if you've got a confessional position and some evidence appears to now contradict it, do you suddenly jump on the bandwagon, or do you wait, or what do you do? I don't know any simple answer to that, and I'm sure you don't know either, that this is a matter of judgment. You see, let me give you a very simple personal example. I've been married for 46 years to the same girl. And if somebody came up and said to me, by the way, you know, last week I saw your wife doing X. If it was inconsistent with my 46 years experience, I wouldn't say, oh, how very interesting. Well, I suppose that could happen. No, I wouldn't. I'd give her the benefit of the doubt for a very long time. And it's the same in scholarship. You see, when you spent your life studying scripture, and you're then told, well, of course, Daniel, the prophet Daniel, cannot be genuine because he mentions a king Belshazzar, and Belshazzar never existed. So if you're going to take the Bible seriously, you must dismiss this as some kind of apocalyptic book written in the 2nd century and so on. Well, if you jump on that bandwagon, and then a few years later somebody is digging in Mesopotamia and comes up with a stone on which the name Belshazzar exists, what do you do then? So you've got to have a balance with what you've experienced up to that point, because nobody starts in a vacuum. And what we're here dealing with really at the back is the old Baconian notion of science as being completely dispassionate, objective, impartial. That's never true. You cannot even make observations without having a theory, first of all. So adjustments to paradigms, as Thomas Kuhn would put it, you have to do those very carefully. And you yourself have to decide when you're going to jump. Now, when it comes to Christian things, you've got the added dimension of loyalty to God and to Christ, theological and intellectual loyalty. And from where I sit, that is the primary thing. Having been convinced for 60 years that Jesus is the Son of God, I'm not going to be overturned by somebody saying, oh, we found his bones in a cave in Galilee. I'm going to take their evidence seriously and read it, but I'm not going to have everything overturned, because my faith in Jesus is multidimensional. It's cumulative. It depends on many, many sources. So you have to make that call. Now, the thing that complicates this kind of thing is peer pressure. What do my colleagues think? Am I out of line and all this kind of thing? Well, we need courageous scholars, quite honestly. We need courageous scholars. And of course, the dividing line often runs, and here I'm speaking from observation outside, of course, that when you think of a book of Daniel, and I mention that not arbitrarily because I've just written a book about it, which was launched this week, the dividing line comes as to what one's worldview is. What I ask myself about a lot of this, since in these sensitive areas, worldview influence is very real. Now, let me speak as a scientist. When we have someone like Richard Lewontin, he's the most famous of the honest people, professor of genetics at Harvard. And of course, the definition of science is problematic, it's very difficult, but he says, you know, we have the materialist spin on science, and we want material solutions, not because we're forced by science to do that, but we're forced by our a priori commitment to materialism, to expect materialist answers, no matter how counterintuitive they are, no matter how dependent on just so stories they are, because, I quote, we must not let a divine foot through the door. Now that's devastatingly honest. And therefore, it is incumbent on all of us to say, well, how much is worldview in here and how much is response to evidence? Because the way you understand a given thing depends on your worldview. Let me give you another example from gynecology. I have a friend who's one of the world's top in vitro fertilization people, and she's an atheist, and we're having a discussion about it, and she said, what's your problem, John? We're talking about experiments on unborn fetuses and so on. It's just a clump of cells. I said, of course it is, from your worldview. But I said, as a Christian, I see that is life. It's not any kind of life. It's human life. And my worldview tells me it's made in the image of God, so what right have you to mess it up? The worldview is determinative in these things. And if I might make a little side remark, worldview are crucial to ethics. What the modern world hasn't quite realized is that ethics and morality are worldview dependent. And that's why we're in such a mess. But that's a topic for another time. Now, the last question was, how do you, I didn't completely understand it, but when do you give up on science? Well, it depends what you mean by science. When do you give up on materialist science? That's a good question. Because the whole irony of the 20th century is this, to my mind. Crick and Watson, utterly determined atheists. They both say that they did their research to prove there was no God. You may not realize that. And so they come up with DNA, the longest word we've ever discovered in the human genome, in the genetic alphabet of 4 letters. And that spells the end of materialism, because it's an information-bearing macromolecule. And information is not material, it's carried on material often, but it itself is non-material. And here we have the irony that materialists doing science, and therefore through a materialist lens, have come up with the most powerful evidence yet that materialism is inadequate to explain it. But that's a topic for another time. I've got to stop. Thank you very much.